Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our webinar today. My name is Brian, and for those of you who don't know about us, we are a government-owned organization in Singapore that invests in and helps to build deep tech startups, talent, and communities. At SG Innovate, our work involves connecting with the global deep tech ecosystem, working with entrepreneurial scientists to bring their innovative research from lab to market, as well as developing deep tech talent. Today's event, Fast Execution Needs Sound Strategy, the Unspoken Dynamics in Deep Tech Development, is presented by SG Innovate and Hello Tomorrow Asia Pacific. Today we have a panel of amazing experts who will be able to share more about their experiences and approaches towards shaping the progress of the deep tech space. I'd like to encourage our audience here today to share their thoughts on this topic and engage with our speakers by using the Q&A box below. And now, with no further ado, I will now pass the time over to Chi Yang from the Hello Tomorrow team. Chi Yang, please.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Brian, and thanks to everyone for tuning into this event. So before we start, I would like to just very quickly share about Hello Tomorrow APAC Challenge that is currently open for applications. This challenge is open to early stage deep tech startups, that is Series A, up to Series A and at TRL 3 and above. And prizes include $30,000 in equity-free prizes, fast track to slingshot finals, as well as our Hello Tomorrow Global Challenge finals, which will be held in Paris early next year. Applications to our APAC Challenge close 31st July, so I encourage you to apply soon if you're interested. And leading into that, the Hello Tomorrow APAC Challenge will be capped off at our Hello Tomorrow APAC Summit, where 15 finalists will pitch to a jury. Apart from that, we'll be also putting together a full day of keynote speeches, panel discussions, and presentations across two separate stages, covering the 4 themes that you see here: sustainable food systems, regenerative industries, cleaner energies, inclusive and affordable health. So this summit will be held on the 5th of October at the National Gallery, and we really hope to see all of you there. And early bird tickets are available now, which you can get from our link, which will be shared in the chat. Okay, now moving on to the main event, let me introduce our 3 speakers here today. The first is Mr. David Toh. David is currently Director and CEO of NTUtive, a wholly owned subsidiary of the NTU of Singapore, responsible for commercializing the university's scientific research and incubating startups. Prior to his role at NTUtive, David spent 20 years in the finance industry at ING Barings, Lehman Brothers, and DBS Asset Management as a leading technology sector analyst and fund manager. Before joining the finance industry, David worked as a process engineer in the semiconductor wafer fab industry. David is a member of the Singapore Stock Exchange Listings Advisory Committee and is also an independent director of SGX-listed iFast Corp. David graduated with a BSc in Material Science and Engineering and a BA in Government and Asian Studies from Cornell University in 1991. Moving on, we have Ms. Sally Ann Williams. As CEO of Cicada, Sally Ann leads Australia's pioneering deep tech incubator, supporting companies solving the world's most pressing problems through science and engineering. Cicada has nurtured hundreds of visionary deep tech innovators to validate, commercialize, and scale high-impact technologies globally across medtech, health tech, ag tech, food tech, clean energy, AI, and manufacturing 4.0. Prior to joining Cicada Innovations, she spent over 12 years at Google as an executive program manager on the engineering team, leading work on R&D collaborations with universities, startup and entrepreneurship engagement, and pioneering work on computer science and STEM education, including world-first collaborations delivering national transformation. Sally Ann also contributed to the foundation of Startup AUS, a non-profit with a mission to transform Australia through technology entrepreneurship. Finally, Dr. Ipshita Mendel-Johnson. Dr. Ipshita is passionate about building inclusive, innovative, and sustainable systems and serves as the founding partner and CEO of Global Biofund. GBF is a value capital fund with a gender-smart lens in the intersection of health and digital technology, and they invest in women-led ventures at early and growth stages, especially those based in US, UK, and ANZ. She currently serves on the boards of Global Engineering Futures and Chiasma NZ, is a judge on Mass Challenge and iGEM, is a visiting lecturer at Harvard School of Public Health and University of Cambridge, and is a member of UNAIDS Health Innovation Exchange Investors Council. She has received multiple awards, including thrice being listed in the 50 Movers and Shakers in Biobusiness, St. Gallen Leader of Tomorrow, and an inaugural 40 Under 40 for University of Auckland. She has written and been interviewed on NASDAQ, Nature Careers, and the Economist Intelligence Unit, and has been a speaker at Foreign Policy, Global Bioeconomy Summit, and Graduate Women in Science, amongst others. Now that our introductions are done, I'll hand over the time to our three speakers.
Thanks, Chiang. David here from Intuitive. So I think I'll kick off the discussions today. To Sally-Ann and Ipsta, I think that when we're dealing with deep tech innovations, most often, the inventors are scientists or PhD postdocs who spent their lives in university labs or research labs. So the pathway to get their innovations into the market often is difficult because sometimes these are inventions looking for problems. So, I'd like to pose this question to Sally-Ann and Ipstas on how do you go about overcoming some of these challenges to help our deep tech companies get to market, because at the end of the day, without a sustainable business model, many of these companies cannot survive. So Sally?
Yeah, I'm happy to give a go at that, David. So thank you. I love the way that you phrased that as, basically technology solutions or innovative solutions looking for a problem to solve. And, that's the conversation that we have every single day with the work that we do at Cicada Innovations, both with our incubator, but more broadly, our national commercialization training programs. And for us, it's kind of twofold. One is, there's a really critical piece that I think we need to think about, which is how do we actually get these deep domain experts to think a little bit outside the box and get some commercial skills and sort of, think like an investor or think like a customer and really interrogate and articulate the problem space and understand sort of the size of the opportunity. And is it a problem for one person or is it a problem for, 10 million people? Because the second one's much more interesting to solve. So part of that is that educational piece and extending it and giving them opportunities and a safe environment to explore their technology within that kind of construct and some mentors and people around them to help them and support them. And then a second one, I think, and I'll be really interested to actually get both of your perspectives on this. But for us here, regardless of whether the startup or the idea is emerging out of Australia or New Zealand or somewhere else in the world or Asia Pac, if it comes to us, one of the things that I sort of say to people that we give a little bit of tough love. So we talk to them about the pragmatic realities of the journey of what it takes to be an entrepreneur. That it's not a valley of death. It's like how many valleys of death for every single company. And that it does need to be something that you want to contribute, your life's work or a significant amount of time to. So that kind of tough love conversation of, is this for you? Is it right? Is it something that you're wanting to lean into? And I spend a lot of my time telling people that the world, to use an example, the world may not need a better Band-Aid because Band-Aids are pretty good and it might be a hard market to disrupt. But maybe there's an adjacency that you can think about your technology. And if we get a chance to influence them before they go into their PhD or their postdoc at that very early stage before they do their research and discovery, that's when we kind of say, let's start with your why. Simon Sinek's book, and looking at the golden circle, start with your why. Why does this need to exist? Why is this a problem? And if you start with there and then research a solution, it's actually going to be a different conversation on the outside of your discovery. So that's kind of our approach, but I'd love to hear from Ipshita and you as well, David, on kind of how you negotiate this one, because it's really hard when somebody's spent years working on something and they're so wedded to their beautiful piece of shiny technology, and it feels like you're insulting their baby sometimes. So I'd love to get your perspectives.
I loved your question, Sally, and on the why. And I think it's changing. So having been a scientist and engineer from university, I think that question of what problem are you solving or why are you developing, it's coming earlier on, even on research grant applications and proposals that deep tech scientists are developing. So I am seeing that that problem definition is becoming more clearer. However, I do find from a venture capital perspective, there's two things I find. One, depending on which geography you talk to with entrepreneurs, when I speak to entrepreneurs in San Francisco or the Bay Area, they'll spend 80% of their time talking about the problem. And I'm getting irritated as an investor on what have you developed? What is the evidence behind it? And what's your business model? And why are you raising this money and what are you going to do with it? On the other hand, when you talk to, I would say more pre-seed or scientists and entrepreneurs coming from incubators and accelerators, and it depends on which programs, because there's some really good programs now with mentors who sharpen their pitches before. You do find some academics caught on the technology itself and going through the details of the technology. And I'm kind of wondering what is the TAM? What is the total addressable market for this? Where are the other competitors? What's unique about this technology? And what's the intellectual property? I'm looking for the full pitch deck and it's not clear. So you do find people in two extremes. And I'd say for our audience with the entrepreneurs, being cognizant who's the funding party here and what stage is your idea at and what do they need to hear. It also has a cultural difference, I find, on who you're pitching to. But David, I think you've probably looked at ideas across your investment experience at different levels. How do you find this product market fit when you're looking at it?
Yeah, I think most of the time we find that the professors have invented something for an industry which they think they might have a solution for, but when they go into a deep dive, they realize, or at least they find out that the industry has an existing solution which they don't need, and then they actually don't have a solution for a problem that needs to be solved, you know. But we find that of the startup companies that we spin off from university, 9 out of 10 fail to raise money from VCs such as yourselves because they don't have a business model, or they have a weak business model, right? So to mitigate that, we've added a venture build team, which will help the PIs articulate what exactly is the business plan that they intend to adopt. And I think using kind of putting my banker's hat on, you know, to articulate that, you know, that business model, oftentimes most bankers would ask, you know, usually there are overlapping sort of parties or customers or interested sort of markets that are intersected or non-intersected. So we usually ask the pointed question of who amongst these parties has a P&L problem, who has a money problem that needs to be solved, you know. So it could be a revenue opportunity or it could be a cost reduction opportunity. But I've been involved with a number of startups where initially they had trouble, you know, with a medical device. It was like, okay, we've got a device that goes into a customer. Is it the doctor who's going to pay for it? Is it the insurance going to pay for it? Or is it the patient who's going to pay for it? And at the end of the day, I think we solved the problem by asking who actually amongst the three parties has a P&L problem, right? So in the end, it was actually the insurance company that had a P&L problem. And so he was able to approach insurance companies and partner with them so that the insurance company would get the patients to adopt the solutions. Yeah, so we try to mitigate with an extensive team of mentors and venture builds, because if they start and there's no business plan or the wrong business model, there is no recourse, you know. It's dead. Yeah.
It's so interesting. I'm just going to jump in there, David, because something you've just said there really resonates with me. And I think this is what we try and do really early with people as well, is get them thinking about that before you've built the product, before you've spent, you know, hundreds of hours, and possibly, I don't know if you're both seeing this, but, you know, my heart breaks when people come and they tell me how much of their own money that they've put into something and they haven't talked to the potential customer. You know, they haven't really validated that there's a need for this solution, which you can do before you've got anything in your hand. You know, you can do without that final product. And one of the things in the medtech sector in particular, because we run a commercialization training program for the whole state and for the country. So we had 1,000 people go through it in the last 12 months. And what's really interesting is busting open this myth that you have to have that prototype there to talk to a customer, but actually you can actually interrogate and understand how much people would be willing to pay for a solution without having the solution fully developed. And, you know, it's such a hard one when somebody's spent their own, you know, huge amount of time, but also then, you know, they're so convicted of their technology, they've spent their own personal money on it, and you kind of have to break their heart a little bit on the business model, that maybe there isn't one, or maybe that need or that market size isn't there. I'm sorry, I totally jumped in, but I'm just keen to hear a little bit more from both of you, because I think this is a really interesting one for the people on the call. Like, I look at things as a glass half full, or two sides of a coin. The greatest challenges have the greatest opportunity, but they're massively hard to get there and to solve. So I don't know what your thoughts are or what your perspectives are on that.
And maybe I'll shift that question a bit, Sally, and we'll all get to discuss how we think about different stages of the idea development and how investors get involved. So I think we've often solely focused on venture capital investors, but I do find there are different shapes and forms of investment, and different investors at different stages are looking for different things. And when you said there, Sally Ann, about that idea, someone's baby project that they've worked on and have they validated or not, all the way to a company at Series B or C stage, which is starting to, has either developed the technology, has done the regulatory work if required in that particular sector, but is looking at scale up. And there are different things that investors at different stages look, and venture capitals can range all the way from pre-seed to Series CD, right? So I feel we should probably think about that in stages. Maybe I'll just add from, for example, our fund experience, we're looking at seed, Series A, and some Series B opportunities. When you're in the health tech, med tech space, what that really is at a point, I don't think we often see any teams which is just an academic professor. By the time they've come with their pitch deck to us, there's a team, there's a CEO, there's a fleshed out scientific and business development team. And we see them presenting that case of what is the problem they're solving much more sharply. In fact, we wouldn't even take a phone call with entrepreneurs when those basics of what is the problem, what is the market, who are the competitors, what is your technology, what is your IP position, what clinical evidence have you generated so far, where are you currently in, if that's the Australian regulation, if that's the UK or the EU or US FDA regulations, have you, which stage are you with the regulation journey, but also have you started building some strategic partnerships? I think some of those things around team, product, market, finance, growth become very important for us as VC investors when you're looking at checks. And these checks at this stage can range. I think now is not a great time with the venture capital markets, and it's definitely VCs pushing down how much valuations you have, but you're looking anywhere between a few hundreds of thousands to a few millions that you're investing. I'll maybe ask Sally, and you and David, from when you look at technologies and companies, what do you look for when you're investing in them, or when you're advising them on other investors they need to engage with?
It's a great question. For me, if I maybe brief and then give David the floor, and I'm happy to come back, is probably three things. Is the problem big enough, right? Especially if we're talking about deep tech, because the capital required to successfully bring a product to market that requires, a regulated pathway if it's health tech, or significant, infrastructure investment because it's hardware or it's, it's a physical product. For us, it's like the size of the market globally, and is that opportunity truly there? The second one we really look at is really interesting is team. And I spend a lot of time with, in our investor community here and globally. And for us, it's not just about the skill set. It's really about, how coachable is this team? Because we go in very early with our deep tech companies. And so we want to be alongside of them. And one of the most pleasing things, and this is the most odd story for me to tell, but one of the most pleasing things that I've had with some of my science and technology founders is that they say to me, as soon as we can raise X amount, I am no longer going to be the CEO. I'm going to be the founder in the business, but I'm staying in the technical pathway or this pathway, because they recognize that their skill set is maybe not in that CEO capabilities, and their understanding about what is best for the business it shows a real deep EQ about themselves, but also, I think a great example of what could be great for a business. And so we kind of look for those things, or is it something that they're driving for different reasons? Does their own personal ego drive too hard? And are they going to be able to be nudged and recognize that as a company grows and scales, the culture and the skill set needed to build that business could be completely different to who starts out with it. And so those kinds of things are really hard to interrogate, but in building a close relationship with those companies, if you're making an investment in them and committing to work alongside of them, those are the kind of probably the two things that are like my number one and my number two, and they're equal. If you don't have one or the other, it's going to be a bit of a rocky road.
Yeah, Sally, and I completely agree with you. The team and the coachability of early stage founders is almost critical, because what usually happens when investors look at early stage startup companies is that they interrogate the founder or the person who's presenting, and then they pose a couple of questions. They're not going to write a ticket after the first meeting, but they'll pose a few questions and then let that team of founders sort of come back maybe a month or a few weeks later and say, look, that question that you posed, I thought about it, I did some homework, and then these are my responses. So generally we find that the ones who are responsive to criticism and open to ideas are the ones that do best, because they have the mental flexibility to pivot when they need to. There's no egos, So, in banking, they always say ego has killed more people on Wall Street than some of the, world wars, right? So, the other issue is sometimes, as a founder, you conflate success with the fact that you're gonna be that founder who's gonna take it from inception all the way to IPO, right? So that's rarely gonna be the case. And for founders who think like that, I think it's gonna be much more challenging to grow that business, because they don't have the skill sets to scale the business, So it's like running a 4x100 marathon or relay race, and the founders must be prepared to accept that their skill sets lie in a particular area and that they should concentrate on their area of expertise. The other thing I think that's also important, especially, I don't know, maybe Ipsita, you can help us answer that question. But I found that for our spin-off companies, governance was a problem, right? We might have an angel investor come in, or a small-time investor come in, or corporate investor comes in, and they invest money without necessarily understanding what type of governance structure should be put in place for the company, because the investors who do so, they're not institutional capital, so they don't understand the role of boards and governance. So because of the lack of governance, the company can either go astray from a strategy standpoint, or from a team standpoint, or from a deliverable standpoint. So you have any comments on that?
For sure. And whilst I agree on the people and coachability side, the founder and coachability side with both of you, I think it's honestly like when you're doing the first pitch that you get from the team, if you don't feel that engagement and coachability, you're not going to go and talk about that deal with your other partners, because it's just hard to do the Q&A, because it takes a lot of rounds for investors to go through that diligence, convince the other partners, convince your investment committee, and then present it to LPs sometimes as well, depending on the nature of the fund. Though I have one flag on founders. I think I find I don't believe in single male or female founder teams. I'm looking at a team. So often, if it is a strong scientific or technical founder who has such a depth, or sometimes I've found people who failed multiple businesses before and they've been in the sector, so they've seen some of the products to market. It really depends to me on who the founder is and what their experience has been, because sometimes there is that added energy or magic that a founder can bring in a company if they are well experienced. So if they've just been in academia and they want to take this to IPO, that doesn't work. But I increasingly find there's a lot of mature, experienced entrepreneurs in the market. And it's just gold when you get those people, because they might have worked in banking or finance, they might have worked in a big corporate before. And when they come and run these teams, it's really useful. So yeah, it's looking at skill sets. And that takes me to the governance question, David, as well. And also the sort of diversity metric our fund has with gender lens and looking for women in founding teams and women in boards. To me, it all comes down to diversity of skill sets, experiences, and discussion on risk. So you can put a gender card on this. You can put a meritocratic skill card on this. You can put racial cards on this, depending on if you're in America. There's a lot of discussion on Black American diversity in companies as well. What I find, you're right, David, by the time most of the deals, even in Australia and New Zealand, and pre-seed, seed, even Series A, a lot of the money is from high net individuals, angel investors, family offices. And a lot of the founders and CEOs and scientific founders don't know what to do with the board. And I think it's almost, it's not just reporting. I think the smart ones figure out it's not just about reporting and communication, it's about who's in your board, and not just having star board members. What can they do for you? So if you have a business model of getting reimbursement from health insurance companies, for example, does your board member have 10, 20 years of experience or networks that can open doors for you? And that role can be a market-driven one. It can be a technical role. It can be an impact-driven one. It can even be personal coaching sometimes. You bring someone completely out of the sector who helps you grow as a CEO or the team. So I think, and sophisticated boards have subcommittees as well, right? There'll be a subcommittee for investor relations or subcommittee for transformation or there's a lot of different elements, and it gets more sophisticated at growth stages. But Salian, I know that as with your work, you're not only focused in early stage companies, you work a lot with growth stage companies too, and you must see that difference in governance as well.
Yeah, it's a great segue, and you've probably seen me nodding away at what you're saying, because it resonates so well with me in Australia here. And I think it's interesting when you start to look at growth companies. We'll start with governance, but actually everything we've all just talked about, we kind of need to pivot into the next iteration of that conversation, because we've been talking about early stage and seed and pre-series A kind of focus. And I think it's true to say that your governance model needs to grow and change as the organization grows and changes. And so I really, really, really believe, and I really, Shita, you just said it so well about who's on your board matters, and their network matters, and that changes as your business grows and scales. And so you need to put good governance in place that actually allows you to refresh your board and forces, I believe in a good forcing function, forces people off so they're not staying there too long, right? Gone are the days that it's good governance. I don't know that it ever was good governance to have somebody on your board for 15 years or, 10 years. So actually kind of putting in those sort of 2 to 3 terms and making sure there's an alignment between who's around the table. And I would say even with that too, it's a really interesting kind of conversation to kind of look at, investors will often want to take a seat on the board, and you need to want to think about that really carefully about who you approach for investment, because we talk all the time about our companies here about making sure that you're getting smart capital. So capital that is aligned with you, that can be more than money and more than a seat on that board table, but has other either adjacent companies and businesses that would be good for you to collaborate with, or its network of investors or its alumni companies that it's worked with over the years are people that they can plug you into to help in your, accelerate your growth. Because the journey's long for deep tech companies, right? We're really talking about long time scales here and significant amounts of money. And I think that kind of flows into the conversation of what does it look like to scale, right? Are your investors that are there, not just your board members that you start off with, but are your first round of investors, are they there for the whole time? Or are they tapping out at a certain point and you're actually looking at, a different investment pool? So when you're going from, $20 million raises to $150 million raise, generally the size of those funds, they may not be the same funds. And we've seen some venture capital funds in Australia certainly be able to grow and stay with their companies to that series, C and beyond. But that's kind of been, it's kind of rare. That's not the typical journey. A lot of our early stage investments here, our investors and venture capital funds are looking for that liquidity event in an earlier time frame. So how do you manage that, and how do you think about that in the context of deep tech where that time frame's longer? And I think the other thing, and then I'd love to hear from both of you about sort of how you think about managing, that change in dynamics of skills and capabilities needed for scale ups, is the other thing that we see a lot of, and we talked a little bit, we touched on team before, that your founding CEO may not be the one that takes it through to the IPO, that leadership team, that whole, I see it all the time. I see entire teams of executives needing to be, some can have the ability to step up and grow with the business, but not everybody does. And so when you get to that 100 person, that 200 person and beyond, things break. And so having the ability, I guess, we try and teach our founders that right from the get-go and go, it's okay, this is part of the journey. You will encounter this. Like, it's not an if, it's you will encounter that you're going to have to make difficult decisions in your organization. And can you be cognizant of that and understand that as the company grows, you're going to have to do that. And you're probably going to, if you're manufacturing, bring in a completely different skill set, because production engineering at scale is a whole different skill set to building the early stage prototype. And you need people with experience. So it is we find it's an evolving journey around governance. It's an evolving journey around leadership in the organization and the executive, but it's also an evolving journey around the skill set in the team as you go through those stages. And so what you end up with at IPO point, or maybe not even IPO, but when you end up at that super scale point where you're a couple of hundred people, you've got products in market around the world, that entire team, including the funders, can look very different to, what we're spinning out right at the early stages. But be keen to hear your perspectives, both David and Ipshita, on that growth phase and what you're seeing and what we think people need to be really aware of and cognizant of.
Yeah, I think to your point, I think having a good board in place is really important, because most deep tech startup companies have a B2B business model, right? It's not a B2C business model. So in a B2C business model, social media marketing, TikTok influencers are critical. But in a B2B business marketing situation, your board is going to be your loudspeaker, your amplifier, because when people do business with a startup, they don't know whether that startup has any credibility or not. So then they fall back and say, well, who's involved with the company? I don't know the C-suite here, but hey, there's a board member who who is a retiree from a Fortune 500 company. So surely he must know something. And for those types of board members, they take a long time to get onto the board because they have everything to lose from their reputational credibility, right? So they can lend a helping hand, but they also have much to lose from their reputation if the company doesn't deliver or if the company turns out to be a fraud. So, and it is the board also that takes a more strategic view that can step back from the day-to-day operations and monitor kind of the quarterly or the semi-annual performance of the company, and then take a view to say that, wait a minute, I think, you know, we've shifted from a 10-man team to a 100-man team now, and the CEO, you know, the founder CEO doesn't seem to be able to execute on the task on hand. So we need to have a come to Jesus conversation with the founder and say, look, maybe you're not the right person to take this to the next stage. And so that's where the governance issue steps in, I think, because if you don't have a right board, then, or if you have no board, then there's no oversight. There's nobody to check. There's no checks and balances to say that, are you doing right? Are you doing wrong? Are you delivering? Are you not delivering, right? You can procrastinate death or trouble or failure for a long time just by convincing, you know, investors to pony up for convertible rounds, interim funding rounds before your next funding round. But I've seen many of these cases where, you know, it's almost like a red flag, right? If a company that's reached Series A funding still doesn't have a decent board, it's almost a red flag, right? With a single or two-man team founder and no board, I would say the probability of failure is quite high. I've seen the difference between a startup which was governed by a good board and a startup founded by a very experienced founder that almost had no board except himself and his co-founder and another investor. And the second company actually ran into trouble because they just were too bogged down by the day-to-day grind that they weren't able to take a strategic view, whereas the company with a good board was able to take a strategic view and exit engineer an M&A opportunity just before that market turned down, you know. So Ipsa, I think you as a VC might have some, you know, views to add to that.
I do, and I completely, David. In fact, I think we don't look at, I mean, because we have a gender lens, so we look at boards and advisory boards at the pitch deck level. So if we just see there's 2 or 3 people involved, it's too early for us. But coming also to scalability and how the people side with board governance changes, the C team evolves itself. But if you just think through, I mean, there's the composition of the company evolving. So the people, all the way from the executive, the operation team, the board governance, that's evolving as you're scaling. Your technology is hitting closer to market, or you are in market. You also have the marketing side becomes more and more important, the commercial and market work streams. And then financing becomes also more complicated, because we've said before that it's not the same angel investors, it's not the same early VCs, especially as you're getting ready towards higher end private funds, or even hitting the public markets, that finance side. So for a lot of founder entrepreneurs, you have to be conscious, what do I enjoy doing here? And how is this business growing? And what's important for me to do? And what is something else, someone else? So, and often the other part of scalability is you don't have to do everything in-house. So there are awesome expert groups when it comes to finance brokerage advice, or market validation, or regulatory validation. And as a startup, you don't have to think about this as a big firm or a medium firm. Sometimes they're even expert consultants who you can come in and bring some of that expertise from. But I'll probably wrap my thoughts on scalability where thinking through people, thinking through market, thinking through operations, and thinking through finance thinking through those 4 boxes is important as you're scaling.
Okay, so I'm conscious about time, and I think we're probably close to that time limit where we have to set aside some time for Q&A from the audience. So, Chiyoung, do you want to moderate or take over for the Q&A?
Hi, sure. In that case, let me just read out one of these questions that we have, the first questions that we have listed. So on commercialization programs, there have been different programs trying to facilitate the development of technical startups. You know, some try to match commercials with technical founders, while some work on preparing technical founders for commercial matters. So, I mean, in your experience, what seems to work better? And then are there any cultural aspects that come to play here?
Okay, I guess I'll take that question since that's our day-to-day bread and butter business. As an engineer, it's easy to teach a scientist or an engineer, at least a young one, business, rather than teach somebody who comes from a business background about engineering. Because in deep tech, you really have to understand the science. And if you don't understand the science, it's very difficult to grow the business or develop a business model off of that. So our mission really is to help the PhD postdocs understand and go through the journey of understanding how do you build a business model, how do you learn basic financial literacy, construct a P&L statement, read a balance sheet, and do your pitch deck and all that stuff. So we try to groom the founding team into potentially one of the members to become the CEO. But if that fails, then we might have to look for an external founder. But Sally Ann, do you have a question?
Yeah, I think you've given a great overview, and maybe I'll just talk. Cicada's been doing this for 22 years, so we've kind of seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of this. And I think it's actually not a binary question of one or the other. We actually do both, and we see a full mix of it. So our commercialization programs, we have a funnel approach. So we have something that is for everybody at the top end of the stack, and they are domains, or maybe not domain specific, but problem space specific, to give people an opportunity to engage in it. And sometimes some founder matching actually happens there between somebody from a business background who might be interested in, for example, the space sector, because we're the home of the National Space Industry Hub. And we might be able to, match them with somebody that's working on, solar panels for space and things like that, which is a whole, very niche kind of solution that you need with a number of satellites that we're putting up there. So we actually find that we get through that sort of funnel approach at the top, whether it's knowledge based and it's specific to in particular domain areas. We get a lot of founders, technical founders that come in and learn the commercialization skills. We get a lot of commercial founders that come in and learn a little bit about that industry, and we sometimes make some magic happen. But the other thing that we do, I think, and we see, is that in the deeper programs, one of the things that we do when we're working with founders and we're getting to that point of that first round of funding, or we're even considering investing in them, we do look at team. We've all talked about team a lot. One person is not going to build your business. It is a team. And so we kind of look at who is in there and what capabilities and strengths do they have. Funnily enough, one of our most successful companies right now, who I'm trying to graduate out, they've got one foot out, but they've still got their labs here, is SpeedX. And SpeedX was actually founded by 2 women when they were made redundant when J&J Labs in Sydney closed down. And I tell this story because there's a couple of things about it that are very unusual and atypical. So this is coming back to how do we actually support people coming through and match them. So Ali, as she talks about it, was north of 50 when they started SpeedX and decided to do this startup. And Alyssa was originally a PhD student she'd supervised. She was well beyond that now. And they took that idea, raised some capital, and started a business. And what I love about what they did is both of them took on the role, the commercial role that they needed to do, but took a view that we need to raise money and do some licensing deals and do whatever we can to stay alive with our team of 4 to get to the point we can hire a CEO, because neither of us wants to be that person. And actually the role for SpeedX CEO was out there actually selling and doing deals and business development. And they found another founder or another person here that had the company that they were in had sold and exited to a multinational and went and poached him. So part of what we see is it's not an either or approach, but there's a big layer of community that overlays how we think about this. And there is a little bit, I don't want to say the word magic, but there is a little bit of, it's more probably social engineering on our part to kind of bring those elements together and then support people and either help them recognize where their gaps are and bring that into their team, or if we can, elevate those gaps in the interim or elevate those skill sets in the interim to get them to the stage where they can potentially afford to bring in that commercial expertise into their team. But you don't have a deep tech company if you don't have anybody technical in it, right? If you're looking for a technical solution, you're going to have to, and you're able to license some IP out of somewhere, and you're a non-technical founder or CEO, you're going to have to go find the technical person into the business straight away. So you're not really, it's a bit of a non-starter otherwise.
I wouldn't add too much, Sally and David, you've spelled it out. I think for me, technical founder comes first. You have to have a technical founder. You're a deep tech company, and back to what you said, Sally, and it's really when we look at the pitch decks again, the technical and commercial expertise is shown. You may not have a chief marketing officer or a chief business officer, especially at early stage, but there's definitely someone commercial in your executive team. They may not be the founder, but there's someone commercial in the team. I'll maybe just give one example quickly. When I worked in a startup in UK called Bactivo, we had 3 co-founders for that company. One was a former Roche, 20-30 years drug discovery experience. One was a professor from one of the top UK universities, global leader on sort of genomics technologies. And third was a tech VC guy, so a finance person. He was a CA, he'd worked in venture funds, he was a CFO. And to me, joining a startup, that was like great. That was the holy trinity for me, going on with the sort of religious thread of sort of jokes that we've had of it. Sometimes you need to have that right mix of people in a founding team, and I found that was a killer. There's a lot of disruption and different thinking that these people have when they look at problems, but it definitely makes it a much more mature company. But I'm conscious we probably have other questions as well, Chi-Yang. So did we want to move to the next one?
Yeah, sure. Let's move on. Okay, so I think we spent a lot of time talking about the talent and skill set might change as we go along the different stages of a company's growth. So one of the questions we had was, do you guys have any best advice or best practices on how to consider or assess the skill set required as part of your core team in the different maturities? So, as the company grows, what becomes important?
I mean, I'm happy to jump in and say, I'm going to keep it short and sweet, is as the company grows, what do you need for that next stage, right? You don't start with the people and the skill set. You start with what are we trying to achieve and list out those objectives of what success looks like in the next phase. And then you go, okay, what do we need to achieve that? What skills do we need? What do we have? What are we missing? And that's something that I think even in our own business, we do that every year, regularly. Every time there's a hiring, and every time there's a hiring opportunity, as somebody leads your team, that's an opportunity to reassess the skill set for the stage of the business that you're moving into and what it is that you need for that future leap. So that's kind of how we do it.
I'll just add that it's hard for startups to get people. And you're competing sometimes with corporates, you're competing with other startups. And I think that's where people in your board, having worked with startups before, your network matters a lot. I have seen so many hires go wrong, having once both from the fund side, but also being on the startup side, nothing tells you who's a good performer in the team till you work with them. So the best thing is if you have someone you've worked with in the past, no one is perfect, but at least you know where their gaps are. That helps a lot. So that's where I'll add my thoughts on talent and skills.
Nothing to add from me.
Sure. Okay, let's take one more question from the audience here. This is about the runway for deep tech companies, right? So, deep tech solutions take a long time to mature and could possibly stay in the lab environment for a very long period of time. So, I mean, maybe for investors or anyone else, what's the ideal kind of runway for deep tech companies? How long do you think they'll take to mature? What kind of gestation period are you guys looking for before potentially an exit event?
I can go first. I think it's not a simple answer. There's no magic number. Deep tech is still quite a broad area. So I'll quickly add from my experience from health tech and med tech. Even that is quite different because health tech from digital health, even with evidence backing, you're looking at from seed to them hitting the market 3 to 5 years. But when it goes into medical technologies, that can then get extended from 6, 7 years plus, depending on the regulatory journey. So I'll pause there and ask David and Sally, and especially from other sectors, how you find that gestation period.
Yeah, so our advice to professors and researchers is to delay incorporation for as long as you can, because the Singapore system has plenty of grant funding available for research. So if it's not ready for market, we would advise faculty not to start a company unless they are doing something related to bio and they have to incorporate for reasons of regulatory submission, because if it's a drug or medical device or drug delivery, that certification comes attached with the company, the startup company. It cannot go to a bunch of professors in the university. So for that reason, you would start a company. But if you're an engineering startup, delay as long as you can until you're about to receive a purchase order. That means iterate with your customer base, get feedback, test for reliability before you decide to start a company.
So I'm probably going to give some counter advice, which is Australia specific. Well, maybe not Australia specific, but it's definitely different to Singapore. You actually need to incorporate when you're wanting to raise capital and you're wanting to actually be able to sell to an entity. So in Australia, if you're doing engineering and if you're doing things in space, if you're a researcher, that is going to complicate the IP no end. And if you're an international researcher that's looking to sell to a prime or something around the, I'm just going to talk about space or ag tech in Australia, not having that clear delineation of having IP signed to an actual business entity is going to be really, really difficult for you to actually sell into the Australian market and into a lot of the markets that we do. So I think it's a case of really understanding the timeframes are really long. Understanding, what stage you're at and, what you're wanting to do by forming a business, and then making sure you've got all of those things in a row. So for us, we won't invest in, we will not actually take in somebody that's still in a research group and hasn't got the IP assigned to us, because we can't turn that into a business. And if we wait until it's really great, some of the IP challenges that we have of how people negotiate in Australia are a little bit different to the US and other university sectors. So I think how long is a piece of string? It's varies between the sectors. If you're a hardware business though, or a manufacturing business, your pathway to market is probably, and your pathway to profitability is probably as long, if not longer, than some of the therapeutics and diagnostics companies, and the capital required is equally high. So new materials companies that are manufacturing and things like that, I think it's about really understanding all of those stages and steps along the way, and kind of going, you know, not comparing yourself to a different deep tech vertical, but understanding the lane that you're in and really focusing on succeeding in your own journey with that, and the different stages and different phases of what you're going to need along the way, because it is unique. There's no real true deep tech 100% repeatable model, I would say.
Thank you for that. We're running a little bit short of time, but I think we'll just do one last question, which I find pretty interesting. So I think all the speakers agreed that coachability of the team is something super important, right, for all stages of the company. But, you know, founders often succeed due to sheer grit and stubbornness. I think especially so in deep tech, where, you know, founders are researchers who've spent many, many years banging their head on problems that have never been solved before. So how can the founder balance these two aspects these two aspects, right? Coachability as well as that grit and stubbornness that they had prior to going on this deep tech commercialization journey.
I mean, I'm going to challenge the premise of that question for whoever asked it. I think any founder needs to have grit and sheer determination and some level of stubbornness that they're going to, you know, stubbornness, or I would prefer to say steadfastness in mission and what they're trying to achieve, right? You look for that in a founder. I don't think these are mutually exclusive. I don't think coachable people are not steadfast or don't have grit. I would actually say coachable people have a higher degree of grit and steadfastness, because they recognize that one of the weaknesses to success could be being blind to their own areas where, you know, their own areas where they might not be as strong. So I actually think they're not mutually exclusive. I actually think you're kind of looking for both of these things. And coachability isn't blindly following everybody's advice. You know, mentor whiplash can be a real thing where you hear from multiple things, but good founders will take it on board, will go away, interrogate it, investigate it, much like you do with any scientific process, and then follow the thing that actually, you know, validates out. And you know, that's part of what you look for, and that's grit and, you know, steadfastness I'm going to use versus stubbornness. I'm probably one of the world's most stubborn people, by the way, but prefer to think of myself in the positive light of steadfast. So I would see this as actually, it's not a binary thing, and the best coachable founders are actually have those characteristics.
Yeah, I'll have nothing more to add, Sally, and you said it really well.
Yeah. That's a really good answer, Sally Ann. So yeah, so I think that's all the time we had today. So thank you, Sally Ann, Shita, and David, for sharing your precious time. So it's a wonderful insights. I'll just give a really quick recap of what was discussed during the session itself. I think we started talking about product market fit. I guess one thread that was identified is that too many founders really spend too much time looking at their technology itself. Maybe not enough thought on the business plan and the business model. They also might be solving a problem which they see, but, you know, it may not be a problem that, you know, the industry itself really has. So eventually when they try to market it out, there's really no... Right. So, and on attracting investment, especially in the later stages, I think speakers have all agreed that, you know, the team is very important. There should be a fleshed out team of, you know, with technical and commercial skill sets. And, you know, when you're looking to attract investment in later stages, there should be a more sharpened product plan and business plan as compared to, you know, earlier on. And of course, as you banged on, coachability, super important for anybody in the founding team, you know, to be able to recognize when they might need outside external input to, you know, help them look past their blind spots and to pivot in the right direction. And finally, in the scaling stage, right, governance is important. Right? The company activities are very different in the spin-off stage all the way to IPO, post-IPO, and we will expect very different teams to operate the company, you know, both in terms of the board as well as the management, right? So I think founders need to be cognizant of that and, you know, be prepared to, you know, step back when they, you know, it's not really they don't really have the right skill sets to lead the company at that stage. Right, so to everyone in the audience, I hope this fireside chat has been both interesting and insightful for all of you. And before we go, I'd just like to finally one more time remind all the deep tech startups among us to apply to our APEC challenge, which again closes on the 31st of July. And if you have any questions or you'd like to just reach out to us, you can reach out to us at the email that's on the screen right now. So I think that wraps up our event for today, and from Hello Tomorrow and our friends at SG Innovate. Thanks again for joining us, and I hope to see all of you at one of our future events. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.